is Dr. Jerry Jaffe, and welcome to the Comical Heathen. Comical Heathen is my own personal exploration of the art and craft of religious satire. This is our 4th episode with many more to come, and I'm personally very psyched about today's interview. Do you TED Talk? I have a lot of friends who like to watch TED Talks. There are over 2,000 TED Talks available for free over a range of platforms like YouTube and Netflix. And you know, the TED videos have been watched worldwide over 1 billion times. 1 billion. Do you have a favorite TED Talk? Mine is probably the one with Michael Shermer called Why People Believe Weird Things. Well, TED is not just some anonymous corporate entity. They are run by people. And as it happens, an old college chum of mine is the managing editor over at TED. Her name is Emily McManus. We met at the University of Toledo as students. We were in a class together back in the 80s. And of all things, that class was about satire. And when I thought of that, it got me thinking, I wonder what kind of editorial process TED uses. How do they curate their videos and lectures? How do they incorporate or manage controversial topics like religion, psychic, pseudoscience, stuff like that? You know, TED's motto is, ideas worth spreading. And I wondered, how do they decide which ideas are the ones worth spreading and which are too fringe or too unscientific, the ideas that are worth not spreading? So Emily and I had a great talk. You know, she told me about her involvement in trying to help TEDx event organizers have some standards and the controversial memo she helped write. She also gives a rundown of how TED started and some of the background there. She tells us about some of her favorite videos, and I'll post a couple of them in the comments on our website. And by the way, we did this interview via Skype, and we actually had a pretty good connection with above average sound quality. But still, it does sound a wee bit Skypey. Nonetheless, please enjoy my conversation with the managing editor at TED, my friend Emily McManus. Well, welcome everyone to the Comical Heathen. This is your host, Dr. Jerry Jaffe, and I am pleased to welcome our guest today, Emily McManus.
Hey
Hi, Emily.
Hey, Jerry.
I want to let everybody know we're recording this interview by Skype, so I hope the sound quality stays up to snuff, and thank you for listening. You work for TED.
I do.
What do you do at TED?
Yeah. Well, I'm the managing editor of TED.
Okay.
And so my job is to work with the curators who are booking speakers for our events, as well as independent TEDx curators who
Sure.
are part of this global program of local events, independent events, and take the videos of speakers that these two people make and put them on the web using digital tools, using web video, articles, things that we can share. Basically, TED is a platform for ideas. And, you know, our platform includes all kinds of things from, you know, TED Talks, the video that you might know, articles, books, events. We do a fellowship program. We give prizes. We have lots and lots of ways that we support great ideas and the sharing of great ideas.
Now,
And,
according to your bio on the TED website, you've been there for 10 years?
I sure have.
Okay.
Yeah.
I want to mention, because it relates to my next question, that for the people listening at home, Emily and I first met in college. That was in the last century when we were both undergraduates at the University of Toledo. Yeah. And how does a person go from being a student at the University of Toledo and end up working at TED? I mean, how do you get that job?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's funny because it's like, I think being from Toledo, Ohio has shaped a lot of the attitude that I take toward our work at TED. Because, you know, what TED is like, it's taking ideas from these really pretty closed societies, closed silos, zones of expertise, of extreme expertise, whether it's like MIT or, you know, it's some, you know, .com at Silicon Valley. It's some place where knowledge is held pretty tightly. And one of the things that I love about what we do at TED is we go out and we find these people and help them share their idea more broadly with a general audience who might care about it. And, you know, I mean, growing up in Toledo, you know, we didn't necessarily have access to those silos of expertise, you know, and there's definitely a talk or two on TED.com that I'm like, you know, if I had seen this when I was 14 or 15, you know, I might have chosen a different life path. I might have thought about things differently. But really, I mean, the way that you get a job like this is you just look like you're going to work really hard.
Well, but I wasn't asking how do I get a job at TED? How did you get a job at TED?
Yeah. So how did I get a job at TED?
Graduate school, qualifications?
Yeah. Well, I was a history major, and so just interested in everything. And actually, my senior year at University of Toledo, I was a copy editor on a historical journal that we published out of not out of the Candidate Center. I worked in an archive as well. Like I was just interested in a lot of different things. But as a copy editor, I had a skill. And then I decided that there probably weren't a lot of jobs for copy editors in Toledo that weren't at the newspaper where my mother also worked. And I was like, you know, I love my mother, but I don't think I can work the same place as her. And Silicon Valley had a lot of jobs for copy editors. And so I moved across the country, and I had this skill, and the skill that I tested very well at this one particular skill, and got a job, worked my way up at one magazine, went to another magazine, and so I've just been this editorial head my whole life. So yeah, if there's one thing I would say to definitely younger people, it's think of a skill that you might have, and you may not end up with doing that job for 1,000 years, but a skill that's nameable is kind of a can opener to a new job, a new city, gives you something beyond just being a nice person.
Copy editor, and then working in publications of different types.
Yep.
And then one day,
all kinds. So I worked at
10 years and one day ago.
I worked at Lefty Weekly newspapers. I worked at a bridal magazine. You know, if you're an editorial person, you're interested in a lot of different kinds of things. And so that was a great skill to take to TED, because I was just interested in lots and lots of stuff. And learned how to research it and how to look at things critically, and not, you know, and to care about presenting information to an audience.
And presenting it well.
Yeah. So that's kind of where I ended up there. And, you know, when I started at TED, there were 7 of us, and I interviewed for my job in Chris Anderson's spare bedroom. And we, you know, it was growing very, very quickly. And now I think we have 175 staff across the world. And that's all in 10 years. It's just been a wild ride. It's been very, very interesting.
When did TED have its first conference?
The first actual TED conference was in 1984. And at that conference, the most exciting thing to me that happened at that conference was a guy from Sony came and demoed the compact disc, which had been invented 2 years ago, but like kind of nobody knew about it.
Right.
You know, and he gets up there and he's got the disc in his hand, and he's like, it's 5 1/4 inches across with a minimal wow and flutter. You know, he's like giving these crazy technical specs, and he holds it up and he goes, and you just play it on the one side. Like, you know, like there was a time we did not know that. And so 84 was the first conference. And then in 2001, the curator who owns it now, TED, Chris Anderson, bought the conference itself. He had just retired from his .com, you know, life, and had set up a foundation. And he thought, he was a philosophy student at Oxford in his early life. And so he thought, you know, my job as a retired guy, it would be really nice to just talk about ideas all day. And so he runs the conference, and then he starts to feel like sharing these amazing talks that are happening on stage, you know, that are just making you laugh and cry and, you know, inspiring all this stuff, that actually sharing it with a broader audience than the 1,000 people who could fit in that room started to feel almost like a moral duty to him, you know, and it's kind of amazing. And so he hired a couple of people to help him think about how to take, you know, a guy standing at a podium or a woman standing at a podium telling you a thing, and turn that into content that people might want to consume around the world on what was just starting out this platform of web video.
And so when did TED.com get born?
Yeah, so 2006, so they put up 6 talks, and they were just 6 talks that, you know, Chris and his team thought were so amazing, and they just put them out on the web, you know, not too much fanfare. I think they sent an email, and the next month, those 6 talks had 1 million views between them. And this is in 2006,
Right.
like just before Twitter, it's before really Facebook was accessible. It's right when YouTube was just starting.
Yeah.
So getting 1 million views on 6 talks in a month was just like jaw-dropping.
Sure.
And it was exciting because we sort of realized that there was this, I wasn't there quite yet. TED realized that there was this appetite for
Sure.
interesting ideas presented well. So I started there, 6 months later in January 2007. And our goal was to post 100 talks by April of 2007 and see what happened. And, we were kind of off to the races at that point.
So now that it's 2016 and a half,
Yep.
about how many videos are available via the TED platform?
Right now, I think it's 2,300, and I should have looked up this number.
Okay.
So 2,300 talks on TED.com that have been featured as a TED Talk of the Day, because that's how many days there have been.
Okay.
And then on our TEDx platform, which is all these independent events that happen around the world that we don't really have that much control over, I think the number now is 80,000 videos on YouTube from TEDx. Okay. Which is like jaw-dropping, 80,000.
It is very jaw-dropping. So when you say there's 2,300 or so on the main TED platform with the goal of releasing one a day, that implies that there's a large archive of backlogged talks.
Yes. Both on the TEDx channel where you can go and look at, these 80,000 talks.
Okay.
And then we actually have a lot of video from 84, from 90, 91 that was sitting in boxes in someone's garage for a while.
As you do.
As you do. And so we've digitized all that, and we just this year kicked off a project to start putting that out in the world. And there's some amazing stuff on these, but I mean, it's just like, we had stuff on beta tapes, we had formats, like we had to buy a Laserdisc player, like we had crazy old stuff.
Well, I can't even look at discs from my graduate school days anymore. The readers don't exist. I don't even know what lost nuggets of genius are stuck on those pieces of plastic.
Oh, yeah, we're a little nervous / excited.
Right. So do you have you said about 80,000 TEDx, but in your own archives in people's garages, do you have a sense of how many archived or collected videos you have in your collection, or talks you have in your collection?
Yeah, I mean, the 80,000 TEDx, the 2,300 of ours. I think there's 1,000 TED Ed videos, which are short educational videos that we make. And then, the archive right now is somewhat uncounted because it is. I mean, it's wild and woolly back there, but So a lot.
Well, I think video archiving, besides being a very underdeveloped endeavor, I suspect that what you're experiencing on a massive scale, a lot of institutions are experiencing, because they in the 80s started videotaping things. So from the 80s till now, there's 30 years worth of videotapes at every institution on the earth.
Yep.
Heaven only knows how many millions of undocumented events or talks or performances.
Brilliant lectures, I was thinking about this the other day. When's the last time you played a CD-ROM? And how hard people worked on CD-ROMs. I remember From Alice to Ocean, which is this thing that came out in the mid-90s. It was this fabulous CD-ROM. And, I mean, if I had it in my hand today, I couldn't play it for you.
Well, and the Comical Heathen, I'm interested in religious satire. And I was thinking about the work that you and your colleagues and staff do at TED, curating and managing and producing content. And I just wonder, how do you navigate the tricky landscape of, matters of faith versus matters of fact, or inspirational speaking versus scientific speaking, or, again, this could lead into talking about science versus pseudoscience, but just in general, is that a thing you have to manage?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely, it's an interesting question that comes up a lot, and it's partly because TED is nonprofit and nonpartisan, and, we try to be neutral around topics of religion. But on the other hand, there are definitely interesting ideas that come out of both religious and non-religious contexts. We have a talk from the Reverend Billy Graham on our site. and Rick Warren, and both of them are very much about,
Mm-hmm.
you should be a good person, but, you should probably also think about being a Christian person.
Okay.
And then we have talks by Richard Dawkins and
Mhm.
Alain de Botton, who are talking about how to navigate the world as an atheist.
Right.
And so it's, for us, it's important that we show as many sides as possible without, necessarily taking a side. And one of the things that I like about is I just reread Richard Dawkins's talk transcript.
Okay.
Which was this super interesting moment at TED. He's, I want to say it's like 2001, late 90s.
Okay.
And he comes out there in this like full on like white suit, and he's booked as a scientist, and he's a well-respected scientist, and he's like, it was 2001, and he comes out to speak as a scientist, and then decides to give a talk about how hard it is to be an atheist as a scientist, even today, even now.
Okay.
And it was a really interesting to me exploration of the idea of how if you are an atheist, it's actually still pretty hard, or was at the time, hard to talk about it,
Right.
hard to talk about it in polite society. And, that if you do feel a certain way about faith, pro or con, our
Sure.
society should be open to
Right.
honesty, and it was an exciting talk in that way, because it was like, he was saying, like, if you're an atheist, like, don't punk out,
Right.
really be one. And
Well, in 2006, a survey was done of the U.S. Congress
mhm.
asking them about matters of faith, and it was an anonymous survey, and only about a third, and that's included representatives and senators, I think,
Mhm.
replied. But of the third who replied, a third said anonymously that they were atheists.
Wow.
But then there was a spot on the form that said, if you like, you can reveal who you are, or you can remain anonymous. Only one person of the people who said they were atheists put their name on their survey. And it was a representative from the state of California.
Ah, yeah. Well, I mean, even just this week, Kasich is ragging on who?
Daniel Radcliffe.
Harry Potter.
Yes.
The fact that this is still accepted discourse,
Sure.
that it's still okay to say, negative things about somebody because of their faith or lack of faith, is pretty stunning. But, I also thought in 2016 there wouldn't be, playboys or racism. So fool me.
So you'll correct me if I have the timeline wrong. From what I can ascertain, in 2012, perhaps fall or December of 2012, TED produced a memo, which I believe was directed towards TEDx organizers.
Local TEDx organizers around the world. Yes, indeed.
Of which there are now many.
Yes, quite a few.
And it was providing some guidelines. I don't know if that's the appropriate word. I'm looking at this letter, and I noticed two things about it immediately.
Mm-hmm.
One is, in the conclusion, the very last sentence, how to stop bad science talks.
Mm-hmm.
So that seems to be, in a nutshell, the theme of this memo, how to stop bad science talks.
Mm-hmm.
And the second thing I noticed is that it was signed by Emily McManus.
Yes, indeed.
So what's the deal with this memo? Why did you write it? Why did you need to write it?
Yeah,
What were your goals?
This was an interesting discussion. So what was happening in the TEDx community is, we were growing this program that we had started on like literally 2 Google Docs. We're like, nobody is going to throw their own TEDx. Nobody wants to do this. We're going to have 6 events, the year that we founded it. And, and we had like 100. And I think there's more than one TEDx talk every day now. Like, people love throwing TEDx events, which is exciting. And we license these events. We give you a free license, and you adhere to some guidelines, mainly around branding, what you can and can't ask for money for. You can't run it as a for-profit thing. And so they became really popular, and they're really fun. And, if you have one in your local area, they're usually interesting to at least track. But what ended up happening is, because we had hundreds and hundreds of curators,
Like on the local level for the TEDx's.
On the local level for the TEDx's, every so often in these thousands and thousands of talks we were getting, there would clearly be a talk where somebody had talked their way onto stage in order to have, their talk filmed very well and, in front of this audience. But what they were saying wasn't necessarily true.
Okay.
And so there were a couple of talks early on. The one that got us started, and actually you can find this on Quora, was a guy who basically believed that we would solve a lot of problems in the world if we went to a base 9 counting system and built this particular kind of engine based on the principles of this new counting system that would produce perpetual power and food for the world. And it was just like this sort of crazed idea. But the guy was really compelling. He was a super, super compelling speaker.
Okay.
And the talk started to get some traction. And then like math bloggers and science bloggers started to go like, is this TED? Is this what TED stands for? Is this kind of like, basically medicine show science? And it was interesting because this is a place where I think about the intersection of what I'm interested in and what you're interested in. Being a stand-up comedian, working a room, communicating, because the guy that gave this talk, and I hope there's no copies of it on YouTube. I'll try and send you a link. But the guy who gave this talk had this way of speaking that was so perfectly tuned to persuade you.
Sure.
He had this like line of patter, and I ended up on the phone with him, which I didn't expect. And he had a way of speaking that was like somebody described it as like talking to Kid Rock.
Okay.
It was just like very insinuating, very like, hey, babe, and at the same time, very, very combative, very like, I am so tuned into you and everything that you say, I am going to flip back because I'm in control of this conversation.
Right.
Like one of those.
I almost wish you had a recording of that conversation.
I know. I swear. It was so fascinating. And afterward, I'm just like, what just happened? So we came out of this conversation. I was like, well, send me the papers on your math, I want to take them seriously and I'll send them to somebody. And he never did. Okay. Because there were no papers, because there's no math. This was just a guy kind of, have you ever seen the Retro Encabulator?
I have not.
I will send you this link. It's hilarious. It's just like 3 minutes of solid gibberish.
Okay.
It's a sort of beautiful comedy routine. There's the Turbo Encabulator, there's the Retro Encabulator, there's the Rockwell Retro Encabulator. And it's just a guy saying stuff he doesn't understand, but very, very compellingly.
Okay.
So we had this talk, and we had this sort of controversy going, and like the Harvard Business Review wrote about it. Like people were really starting to notice that this sort of bad science, that there wasn't a hard gate around it.
Sure.
For TEDx. That if somebody was persuasive enough, they could get onto a TEDx stage. And there were a couple of other incidents like that where we were just like, that we need to give our TEDx organizers some guidance, sure. And not just guidance of like, you have to be a science expert to book a scientist. Because that's the big thing that we didn't want to say. We were just like, you should book people who are interesting to you in your community. But these are some tools to know if somebody is going to bring non-science to your stage. Okay. And a lot of the tools are not even about knowing science, because, what we were hearing back from people is like, I want to book this mathematician. I'm not a math expert. Right. Like, how can I tell if this person's right or wrong? And so one of the parts of the letter that I think is so interesting is actually stolen from a woman named Emily Willingham, completely stolen, and I credit her.
Yes, you do credit her. I noticed that. So
yeah.
So no plagiarism here.
Thank you. Yeah, but it's the idea of like that there are behaviors around pseudoscience that you can also look for, so that you can start to develop your spidey sense, and that would be somebody who is very aggressive, somebody who has claims to have knowledge no one else has, people who live in a complete silo of just information that they've created about themselves.
Yeah, it's in the memo, like one point is red flag topics.
Yeah.
And then subsequently it's red flag behaviors.
Yeah.
Yes.
And it's because we realized we couldn't list every possible thing that could go wrong.
Right.
There are definitely some things that are red flags. For me personally, somebody who is talking about autism cures or autism treatments that are not based in fact, Like,
Right.
those people can go to hell.
Indeed.
Like, you need to look hard at people like that because it's an industry.
Right.
It's not a scientific field. It's an industry meant to,
Sure.
generate cash on the back of parents. And there's some other places where, again, you're going to be like, are you, this person may or may not be making advances in the field of science, but it is a field of science that attracts a lot of fluff, and you need to be extra careful.
Sure.
And you have a responsibility to be careful around these particular fields. But then the behavior thing is more just like, if somebody comes at you from complete left field, and you're just like, I've never heard of this guy, I've never heard of this science, I'm not going to become an expert in it, but I'm seeing these behaviors from this person. That's another way just to develop your spidey sense, and just to say, like, there's something a little funky about this, and I am going to dig deeper.
Just so our listeners, you can find this memo online in different places, so you can find it to read it. But just so our listeners know, what were 2 or 3 of the red flag topics that you mentioned?
Let's see. We've got, food as medicine, as cures for autism. Is tough. And again, not a banned topic by any means, but, a place where you need to be careful. And we saw different forms of healing,
Sure.
which is tough. But, we have seen talks on things like energy fields, placebos, crystals.
Right.
Perpetual motion, alchemy, time travel. I mean,
sure.
And there's a point where you should be careful, and there's interesting thinking around all these fields, but you should know that they're also attracting people who aren't necessarily going to tell you the truth to get on your stage in front of your audience.
One of your topics, and I'm just looking at the memo right now, is the fusion of science and spirituality.
Yeah.
So what is TED watching out for there, or advising people to watch out for there?
Yeah, in that case, it's trying to prove that a particular religious belief is correct using science. And there's a couple of physicists who are kind of in that field. The fact that we have, whatever mountains means that God made them, kind of thing. And it's tough because if I had this letter to write again, because again, we wrote this letter not very quickly, but under duress.
Sure.
We wrote this letter in reaction to some events that we were a little bit freaked out by.
And that were kind of happening in real time as well, so they needed attention.
And you'll see up above, we have made a public correction to it, which is that we also name as one of our red flag topics anti-GMO foodists, and I put that in air quotes, and I don't know if you can do that in Audacity.
Yes.
Because that's a super offensive term. You don't call somebody a foodist, and I was a jerk to do it. It's not, it wasn't a nice word to use, and we were kind of like, oh God, it really was like speaking at a moment of stress.
Right. So this memo gets out to your TEDx organizers, and then into the interwebs and the World Wide Webs. And what were some of the reactions to this memo? Like, that started a whole new chapter of good and bad, right?
It definitely, it hasn't stopped psychic healers from trying to get to the TEDx stage.
Okay.
And, I don't think anything ever will stop. That kind of thing. The thing is, the TEDx program is reflective of humanity as a whole. It's reflective of things that people are interested in, and what we need and what we needed and what this is a pretty flexible document where you can kind of go, you can throw your idea against it, and you might find an answer. You might need to call the TEDx staffer, in New York, and just go, I need a gut check on this. But it started the conversation, and then what meant a lot to me at the time was a couple of the science bloggers who had been a little cranky about TED, because science is about being careful, and it's about being fact-based and
it's about participating in a process. So,
exactly.
If you're not participating in the process, both the speakers, but then also the curators. Yeah, and
I think what people liked about this letter was that it showed that we were in the process with them.
Sure.
I really like the way you put it, like that, sort of throwing up our hands and going, oh, this is we can't solve this problem. But trying to jump into the conversation a little bit, and without like laying the science smackdown on people.
Well, I will say, in the memos available for people to see if they're super curious. Another part of the memo also says, sort of point blank, no topic is banned, but
some are a little funky.
Yes, but that doesn't mean that you don't. Yeah, I mean, it does say no topic is banned. And then I think the rest of the memo is, but that doesn't mean you don't have a curatorial responsibility. Like you still have a responsibility.
That's a nice way to put it. Because exactly, like, if you're thinking about, your responsibility to your audience.
Right.
Earlier up in the letter, there's a point where we were saying, there's no bright and shining line between pseudoscience and real science. There's stuff that seems extremely freaky now,
right.
That's on the edge of science that might turn out to be right or wrong,
right.
and...
But I did want to ask, I mean, again, I think we both know examples. I mean, there were, at least in some quarters, some felt that this letter represented some form of censorship.
Oh, for sure.
Right.
Yeah. And, that's... I mean, people are always going to conflate curation and censorship.
Yes.
And at a certain point, you have to think about your responsibility as a platform, as a place that is putting out information. To me, one of the lines between, pseudoscience and pseudoscience or science, or one of the tests that you can give, when you're thinking about whether or not to promote something. And again, when people are saying censorship, obviously, we're coming from a very Western perspective. We're coming from a background of government free speech. When we talk about censorship in the real world and the rest of the world, the idea that somebody can't put their psychic healing talk up on TEDx becomes laughable.
Right. Yes.
I mean, this is a world where journalists are routinely stalked and killed. This is not, this is not a free speech problem that I'm like,
Well, I also think it's a parallel. I don't know if it's exactly the same, but I'll tell you what it reminds me of. Fans of either a TV show or an artist or a singer or a comedian, who the artist, if they're professional, they're probably getting paid, but they're giving perhaps years and decades worth of content, and then some fan now reverses it and complains you don't have a right to do that.
Oh, gotcha.
There's thousands of hours of Seinfeld generated comedy out there, and then if one episode of Seinfeld something offends you, the whole project is now torn down in some people's minds. So to me, TED is almost providing a public service, and some people have turned it around in their mind as if TED owes them something.
Thank you for saying that. I mean, the thing is, we do owe our audience certain things. We owe them a responsibility to be accurate. We owe them, a responsibility to live out our goals of being nonpartisan and being open and global, and all these things that we really want to believe in. But if I'm gonna, if you are bound and determined to put a comment under a TED Talk about, how sweaty one of my speakers looks and he should have worn a comb over, I'm going to delete that comment, and that is not a free speech issue.
I at least want to tackle an example, and we can spend a moment or many moments. I'll leave that up to you. But right around the same time, I think January of 2013, Rupert Sheldrake gave a now infamous TEDx talk in London.
Yes, he did.
That did eventually end up on the TED blog in one form or another. But at the time, it sort of fell right in the smack dab of this conversation about science versus pseudoscience and curatorial responsibilities.
Yes, and it was an interesting moment for us with TEDx as well as a growing company, because we learned a hard lesson with the Rupert Sheldrake controversy, and that is that the internet does not like things being taken off of it.
There's people right now looking for Janice Jackson's nipple. I don't think.
What?
There's people right now looking for Janice Jackson's nipple.
Right?
So.
It's
there somewhere.
There. And that's the thing with all these other TEDx talks. If you want them, you can find them. The internet does. It does not forget. Right. And
so what? In a nutshell, what happened with Sheldrake?
Rupert Sheldrake is this interesting guy. And, not a dumb guy. He's a, tenured professor at some university in England.
Mm-hmm.
He has this thesis that, there are aspects of science that are actively lying to people, that science is a delusion.
Right.
I think that's his book is called The Science Delusion.
Right.
And, that there are things that scientists aren't telling you.
Right.
And it's a very confrontational book, obviously, especially coming from a tenured professor at, whatever university he's at. He has some fans, but he also has some people who really, 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 really don't like him. So we saw the talk, and our scientists in our community were like, you can't give this guy a platform.
Right.
We looked at the talk.
And the speech was about how science is lying to you.
Yeah, and we looked at the talk, we had it transcribed, we spent a lot of time thinking about this. And we came to me, one of the lines between science and pseudoscience that touches on the responsibility of the presenter. And that line is, will promoting this talk make something actively bad?
Right.
And an example might be if we had a talk from a psychic healer who's like, the reason that you have cancer is that you have these negative thoughts and you need to get the negative thoughts out.
Right.
And the mother of a 5-year-old with cancer looks at this and goes, oh, shoot, this is all my fault. What happened? Right. That's actively bad. That's making that mother's life bad, Or if someone says, you should try and cure your cancer with Reiki and healing touch, and you can go ahead and get off your chemo.
Right.
That's making somebody's life actively bad. One of the things that gets under my skin, and I think we're seeing this a lot in this current election cycle, is people who sow mistrust in institutions that I think are valid. Science as a whole is based on, as you say, developing ideas. It's this ideally self-correcting system. And, I hear this kind of rhetoric now around the independent media, that you should stop trusting the media. The media is lying to you. I mean, I'm in the media. We're not aligning in any way on this, and so it seemed to me pernicious, honestly, that you would deliberately sow mistrust in the system.
Well,
I think it's fine if you challenge it, obviously. But the idea that you're going out to a lay audience and telling them not to trust science really bugged me.
Yes. Well, isn't Sheldrake associated with being a champion of the notion of morphic resonances? Isn't that one of his things? Guy.
Yeah, and a lot of the things that he's.
I mean, just under the category of him and the science delusion, science is lying to you thesis is, shall we say, legitimate scientists have done experiments on his ideas of morphic resonance, demonstrating they don't work. And then he has written about those experiments in his book, like other people's experiments, and then saying they worked. Like he's literally misconstruing experiments.
And that's the line to me. Like, if he's just a muckraker and an interesting guy, and he's like, we should be looking harder at this problem, amazing. But if he's, actively not only sort of misrepresenting others' work, to me, when someone is trying to sow mistrust in a system, it's because they have another system they're trying to sell you.
Well, I would worry that the system that they're trying to sell you is that they are better than the system.
Yeah.
Trust me, don't trust the system.
And P.S. buy my book.
Yes, and buy my book. Before we run out of time, I wanted to ask you one more question, perhaps on a lighter note, as my interest is in comedy and religious satire. TED has certainly included talks by well-known comedians and entertainers. Just as a random, almost plug for yourself, what's your favorite entertainer or comedian TED Talk?
I mean, I'm going to... This is awful. One of my favorite funny TEDx talks is from Will Steven at TEDx New York. How to sound smart in your TED Talk.
Okay.
And it's just like this brutal note-for-note parody of the form.
Okay.
And we show it now to speakers, and we're like, you don't have to do this stuff, Because the thing is, like, when we think about religion, when we think about faith, when we think about, when we think about sharing an idea, like, the thing you always want to avoid is an empty form.
Right.
Where you have the red rug and you have the little microphone on your head and you have the fancy hand gestures and voila, you have a TED Talk. No,
Yes.
you have the form of a TED Talk. So yeah, I love Will Stevens' talk. I love Reggie Watts' talk from TED, which is another just like extremely weird parody of a TED Talk. Obviously, I'm extremely I'm a connoisseur of TED Talk parodies.
Yes.
But they always tell us something interesting, and
I often when teaching theater classes or acting classes, have the students stage acting classes, and then 1 out of 5 will do a parody of me.
Oh, that's brutal.
Yes, and it's because I've given them license to do this, so I almost can't say anything. So rather, it's more like a learnable moment for me. Okay.
You're like, ooh.
Here's things they can make fun of about me.
Yeah, and you makes you a better, richer person, right? But yeah, I love that. I love when people pull our leg a little bit.
Well, before I say thank you and goodbye, is there anything else on the topic of either religious satire or TED Talks that you'd like to get off your chest?
Yeah, that's a good question. I had some thoughts on comparing church and going to a TED.
Sure.
Which were kind of amazing. But my favorite thing that I wrote ahead of time was, if you are an atheist, don't punk out. Yeah, no, I love it.
Well, I saw a demographic split of, they talk about the rise of the nuns the past few years, Nones, which not every nun, None, is an atheist, but they're people who, when asked what their religion is on census forms, pick none as their choice. So that could include atheists, agnostics, other types of spiritualists, solo pilgrims. Mm-hmm. But that is the largest growing religious demographic in the country right now, is nuns. And if you take the designator Christian and break it down into separate categories like Protestant, Episcopalian, Catholic, nuns are bigger than I think any of those individual groups. Evangelicals might be close, so it's nuns and evangelicals are the two biggest religious groups if you split the Christians out.
And it's one of the things we think about with what do you miss once you're a nun?
Yes.
What do you miss about? Because I remember when I was 10, and I'm sitting at the sitting in the pews. I went to Baptist church as a kid, and I'm sitting in the pew, and I'm like, I don't think there's a God, and I'm 10. You met me when I was 16. You could picture a 10-year-old me going, I don't think there's a God. But I really liked church.
Sure. Absolutely.
And went to Ashland Avenue Baptist Church in, downtown Toledo. And there was always a sign out front that was what the sermon was for that week.
Sure.
And I was always like, do people literally walk by and go oh, I got to get in for this one?
Oh, yes. Like people driving around on Sunday morning looking at the different sermon titles until they pick the one that appeals to them that day.
Someone's going to really take on Corinthians, this is it. And
yes. The definitive sermon on Corinthians.
It's non-viral content. You just go and you just have this nice community time, and you
absolutely
see you act your best and you dress your best and you act in this sort of pretty ritualistic, communal way, and you see the best of people.
Sure.
And I think actually Alain de Botton talks about what atheists should be looking at from different church experiences. And how do we recreate that nice sense of community and understanding and, being at your best in a, formal way.
Well, that almost sounds like a positive enough note on which to stop. So
well done, Jerry.
It just remains. Thank you. Well played. It just remains for me, your host, Dr. Jerry Jaffe, to thank you, Emily McManus, for being our guest today.
Oh, my pleasure, Jerry. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you.
This is your host again, Dr. Jerry Jaffe. What a great time I had with catching up with Emily. I'm a big TED watcher, and I really enjoyed hearing more about the history and behind-the-scenes intrigue of working at TED. Emily's a wit and a wag and is always fun to talk to about just anything. The story about the unexpected fallout from that memo meant to help local TEDx organizers was certainly, a bit of a surprise. I found that interesting. I have a link to the memo included in the information with this podcast if you want to take a look at it yourself. Now, before we finish up today, I'd like to make a quick trip over to the rabbit hutch. Me and my wife are rabbit enthusiasts, and we keep two beautiful Holland lops, Kevin Bacon and Newton. I've noticed that one of the last uses for old-fashioned paper newspapers is lining the bottom of a rabbit cage, and that's what we do. The funny thing happens when doing that, though, I come across a lot of headlines. It's just like I've gone back to reading the newspaper, but only at the bottom of rabbit cages. And there's one type of headline that always stands out to me. I see a lot of historical and factual misinformation out there about religion in newspapers and other news because of the way most reporters treat religion, like soft journalism. Because of that, not even doing too much digging, you can find a lot of questionable ideas or indeed factual errors in some articles on religion. Whenever I find examples of these, I have to set the record straight, because it's good for our souls to know things. So I'd like to pull a headline out of the bottom of the rabbit hutch. Sometimes when you go over to the rabbits, and the rabbits are just lying around relaxing, you'll see the rabbits lie on top of each other like they're pillows. When Kevin Bacon uses Newton for a pillow, that is the cutest thing I've ever seen. No, wait a second. Maybe I should back up. When Kevin Bacon uses Newton for a pillow, that's the cutest thing I've ever seen, except, of course, for my beautiful wife. No, wait a second. Okay, one more time. Yeah, I got it. I'll say it this way. Whenever Kevin Bacon uses Newton for a pillow, that is the cutest thing I've ever seen, except for my beautiful wife and my lovely children. But then, definitely, Kevin Bacon using Newton for a pillow. So what did I find today at the bottom of the rabbit hutch? An article from the Huffington Post with this headline: "There are no irreligious people." I mean, that caught my eye right away, because that is quite a generalization. And it's like, well, knock me out and call me honey mustard. I wanted to see what this writer had in mind. Turns out this was an op-ed piece written by Rabbi Eric Yoffe, who is a well-known speaker and writer. He's written for Time and the Huffington Post and other publications. So what does Rabbi Yoffe think about "there are no irreligious people"? So he starts off his essay asserting boldly, quote, "We are all religious. Every one of us." Wrong again. Thank you for playing. But not me. I just want to assure you that if you're ever on Jeopardy and the answer is Jerry Joffe, you can buzz in and say, "Who is someone who is completely without religion?" Because you will get the right answer. In fact, I hope it was double Jeopardy, and you bet it all because you're going to win a lot of money. Because what has two thumbs and is completely without religion? This guy. Well, Rabbi Yoffe goes on to claim, and this is another quote, "Religion is deeply rooted in human nature and a response to certain profound and universal needs of humankind." Let's see here. Deeply rooted, he says. Profound, he says. Humankind, universal needs. I just want to stop for a second here and point out that poetry does not equal facts. Like, there are a lot of beautiful words in what he just said there. But that doesn't make it true because it sounds neat. Sadly, poetry itself is not a form of evidence. And the actual idea he's articulating lacks any support in psychology, sociology, anthropology, anything. Just sometimes words sound nice together. But even if something is good poetry, that doesn't make it true. This offends me as both a good teacher and a bad poet myself. If good poetry was all we needed, we'd all worship at the church of Bob Dylan, and Shakespeare would have discovered evolution. Going on, Rabbi Yoffe asserts, "You cannot extinguish religion. But I say, give us a chance. Let us try. Don't rule it out. We are still working on it." I mean, that's what they said in 1977 about disco, but no one wears bell-bottoms anymore. And you don't know how cultures are going to change in the future. I mean, before the 14th century, no one wore pants. Then, pants were invented in the 14th century. Now you take them for granted. Now everybody wears them. Men wear pants, women wear pants, kids wear pants. Everyone wears pants, except for a few cartoon ducks. Those sick, perverted ducks. But that's it. Everybody else wears pants. So you see, culture can change. You don't know what the future can hold for culture. As Rabbi Yoffe goes on, he starts to try to define what he means by religion. He has this quote: religion is, quote, that part of our being that gives expression to the human craving for transcendence. Human craving? Isn't that definition human craving? Just a little too convenient if you were in some kind of a coffee house debate with your religious friends. Religion is now human craving for transcendence? What kind of definition for religion is that? Any definition of religion that does not include concepts like faith or the supernatural is not a normal or typical definition for the word religion. I mean, if I have desire or longing in my heart, but I don't believe in fairies or reincarnation or talking bushes, how am I still religious? Heck, there is no evidence actually that any part of our human being craves transcendence. I barely even believe in the movie Transcendence. In philosophy, changing the terms of your definition or your evidence during an argument so you can never be wrong is called moving the goalposts. And that is what Rabbi Yoffe is doing with his definition of religion. He's trying to make it fit his theme that everyone is religious, even people who are not. For example, he goes on to define religion, and this is another quote, the wellspring of optimism and hope. Now the definition of religion is hope? That's an even worse definition for religion. It's just too convenient. It's too convenient. It's too simple. But it's meaningless as an actual definition. Now, if you have an atheist say they don't believe in God and the religious friend fires back, do you hope? That somehow proves the atheist is a believer in someone else's dogma? I have hope. I admit it to you today, I have hope. I hope that I am not religious. Wah, wah, and with that paradox, I think I just broke the God machine. Even more useless as a definition for a debate, Rabbi Yoffe then claims, another quote here, religion being misused is not religion, but religion fostering care, healing, and peace is real religion. He keeps making his definition simpler, and he keeps moving the goalposts, or as Tom Brady would call it, deflating the football. Well, isn't that convenient? Anything a non-believer might point out as harmful about religion, and now suddenly and magically, those things are not actually religion anymore. Well, that'll be a great comfort to all the medieval Jews who were forced by the Inquisition to convert to Christianity. That'll help everyone who thinks they're going to hell because they ate meat on Friday. Misusing religion? How about misusing religion for vague, preachy, self-justifying blog articles? Is that misuse of religion? If we deflate this football anymore, all we're going to have left is the pigskin, and then, depending on your religion, you might not even be able to touch that. I appreciate that later on in his column something Rabbi Yoffe says, because he frankly admits that he is making this claim that there are no religious people, and I'm quoting him, mostly without evidence. Which was his way of telling me that I had just wasted 10 minutes of my time. Arguing without evidence is like trying to boil water without heat. 10 minutes of my life is just gone, and I'm not even going to get any tea out of the deal. This is not how arguments are supposed to go. I find I do live in hope. Hope for a world where evidence is the basis for our rational knowledge, not wishful thinking. It's wishful thinking and lack of evidence that leads to things like faith healers or the Creation Museum or Sean Hannity. He then wanted to point out that a lot of people around the world believe in religion, so that should mean something, right? He said, look at all the people that make up the 10,000 different religions in the world today. I said, make up is the perfect word for that statement. Yes, they made up those 10,000 religions. Wordplay. That was pretty clever, I thought. Hey, when I used to play Dungeons and Dragons in high school, I made up all kinds of elven girlfriends, but that doesn't mean I ever actually had sex. Not even if I rolled a natural 20. I will say with all sincerity that I embrace Rabbi Yoffe's hopes for peace and healing, but my ability to empathize with him does not mean I believe in religion. Rabbi Yoffe argues without evidence that I am religious, even if I say I am not. Yet I would argue that without evidence, he cannot even prove that he himself is religious. Wow, the power of the paradox. Our writer here ruins his own argument by contradicting himself. He argues that we are all religious, like it or not. I counter that some of us indeed are not religious, whether he likes it or not. And that is what I found at the bottom of the rabbit hutch underneath the big hopping feet of Kevin Bacon and Newton. Since I consider misinformation a sin, I call this misinformation. Whenever I see examples of misinformation, I have to speak out. I'm not trying to ruin anybody else's good time, but hey, it's not about your dogma. It's my karma, and I'm all about spreading the love. Having said that, it just remains for me to thank Emily McManus for being our guest today on the Comical Heathen. I want to thank Kevin Bacon and Newton for inspiring me to continue to read newspaper headlines. I want to thank my very good friend Jeff Geddert for all of his technical advice and moral support. And remember, that lovely Bach organ music you hear during the show is played by my friend Mark Bell. If you enjoy his music, you can purchase Mark's CD online. And that just remains for me to thank you for listening, and I hope you'll join us again. I'm Dr. Jerry Jaffe. Thank you.